Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Well, today we're going to do a different kind of video. It's between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. They're both legendary groups, so how did they know each other and what did they think about each other? This should be interesting to find out. So how did they meet? The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were nudged into meeting each other through their managers. The Beatles went to hear the Stones play at a pub in Richmond. The Rolling Stones at this time were a blues cover band. After the show, they all went to an apartment building in Chelsea and partied till 4 in the morning, according to Paul. Bill Wyman's thoughts on each Beatle. Bill said that he used to see John Lennon a lot when he was in America. They would sit down and talk, and John said to Bill, "I'd love to go on tour with you and Charlie as a rhythm section one day." And Bill said, of course, that didn't happen. Bill said he used to hang out a lot with Paul, too. And Bill said, "I actually gave them a lot of Beatles memorabilia that they never had, like films of them playing Shea Stadium and one of them playing Washington in February 1964, which was the first show they ever did in America. And then I gave Ringo a load of Tony Hancock stuff." Bill said he was the closest to Ringo. He would see him in the 1970s when he lived in Monte Carlo, and Bill lived in the south of France. He said that they went to clubs, got drunk, went to Monte Carlo, and had dinners. And Ringo would also go to Bill's house and watch music videos. Bill said that they were good times, and he still sees Ringo occasionally. And Bill said that George played on one of the Rhythm Kings albums that he did before he died. And Bill had phoned George and asked him to do a guitar part on the track he was doing. And George said, "What are you calling me for? You got two of the best guitarists in the world in your band, Albert Lee and Martin Taylor. What do you want me for? I only play one note." And Bill said to him, "George, that's the note that I want." So he said, "All right," and then sent me the tape. Bill said his guitar part was great. So what did Keith Richards think about the Beatles? Keith thought that John was a beautiful spirit, and he said he used to hang out with him a lot. George was a lovely guy. Richards loved George's guitar playing and said that it spoke for itself. George was an artist who was, because he didn't write many songs, but the ones that he did write were very meaningful, very well worked out and well thought about. An incredibly meticulous man with respect to his work and to what he wanted to do, he continued to Rolling Stone. And he said that George reminded me very much of Charlie Watts in that way, in many ways, the understatedness, the modesty, and just being a gentleman, really. There's very few I'd give that word to, and I wouldn't give it to myself, but he was a gent. And then he said, "We got Paul, a great songwriter, and Ringo. What a guy, what a steady beat." So what did Charlie think of the Beatles? He was friends with the Beatles. I found the article in Far Out magazine, and it said that Charlie was into jazz more than rock and roll, even though he was in a rock band. And Charlie once proclaimed, "I don't really love rock and roll, I love jazz, but I love playing rock and roll with the Stones." And Charlie Watts once told Rolling Stone, "The Beatles, they weren't something that I wanted to be. We did shows with them on stage. They didn't do bugger all. None of them moved much, and they didn't have a great sound. It wasn't like Eric Clapton and Cream or Jimi Hendrix." Despite his previous remarks, Watts added, "But the Beatles were a phenomenon. The great thing was how people looked at them. That's what you got, more than John Lennon going la 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 or Paul McCartney shaking his head. The effect was amazing." So what did Mick think of John Lennon? According to BeatlesDaily.com, on a personal level, Jagger and Lennon had some connections and shared interests. Both were outspoken about social and political issues, often using their platforms to promote peace and social change, and they also shared a rebellious and countercultural spirit, questioning authority and challenging societal norms. The Beatles disbanded, and the Stones were still going on, so the friendship between John and Mick drifted apart. Before John was murdered, he had contacted Mick and wanted to work with him on a project. So what Mick thought about George Harrison? Far Out magazine stated that George very much concentrated on the spiritual part of his life, Mick Jagger said, of Harrison in a Rolling Stone retrospective. It was more than a passing fancy. It looked like it was sort of a faddish thing at the time, but it stayed with George. You got the feeling that most people were dabbling in spirituality, but for George it was perhaps the major part of his life once he discovered it. So Paul's thoughts on Charlie Watts. Paul thought that Charlie was a fantastic drummer, steady as a rock, and he also thought everyone we knew was into fashion, and I was thinking about Charlie Watts the other day, and Charlie was quite the dandy. He would go to Savile Row and get his suits. We all loved it. And George Harrison's thoughts on the Rolling Stones. In a 1988 interview with MTV, George said he liked Richards a lot. George left a party at Richards' home, Redlands, right before the police raided the place and arrested him and Jagger. And then later, Keith recalled the time that he and George used to get high together. And George said, I hadn't seen Keith in years. He's lived, I presume, in Jamaica and New York, and I haven't seen him in a long time. Yeah, I like Keith a lot. We occasionally sent t-shirts to each other. And then George Harrison helped get the Rolling Stones signed to Decca Records. Dick Rowe, an executive at Decca Records, asked George who the next up-and-coming group was, and George said the Rolling Stones. The Beatles got the Rolling Stones started. Although the rockers were successful, they didn't truly break into the mainstream until they were gifted one of the Beatles' tracks, I Want to Be Your Man, in 1963. This song got them to number 12 on the singles charts and skyrocketed their notoriety. Paul told Howard Stern a few years ago, the Stones are a fantastic group. I go to see them every time they come out because they're a great, great band, and Mick can really do it, the singing and the moves, and Keith and now Ronnie and Charlie. They're great, I love them. They're sort of rooted in the blues, though, the Beatles explained. So when they're kind of writing stuff to do with the blues, whereas we have more influences. Keith once said to me, Paul, you're really lucky in your band you had 4 singers. We had 1. Paul also told Howard, we started to notice, Paul joked, that whenever we did something, the Stones sort of did it shortly thereafter. We went to America and we had huge success. Then the Stones went to America. There was a lot of that. But we were great friends, and we still are. We admire each other. And then John Lennon said it was a great period from his 1970 interview with Rolling Stone. We were like the kings of the jungle then, and we were very close to the Stones. And I don't know how close the others were, but I spent a lot of time with Brian and Mick. I admired them. I dug them. I spent a lot of time with them, and it was great. And we all used to go around London in cars and meet each other and talk about music with the Animals and Eric and all that. It was a really good time. That was the best period, fame-wise. We didn't get mobbed so much, and it was like a men's smoking club. Just a very good scene. Now we're getting into the slings and arrows of things said about each other. When asked about what he thought of the Rolling Stones, Lennon replied, I think it's a lot of hype. I like honky-tonk women, but I think Mick's a joke with all that fag dancing. I always did. I enjoy it. I'll probably go and see his films and all, like everybody else, but really, I think it's a joke. He was also angry with things Jagger said about the Beatles. I think Mick got jealous. I was always very respectful about Mick and the Stones, but he said a lot of tardy things about the Beatles, which I'm hurt by because, I can knock the Beatles, but don't let Mick Jagger knock them. And then Lennon made the not-so-subtle hint that Jagger and the Stones copied the Beatles. I would like to just list what we did and what the Stones did 2 months after on every effing album, every effing thing we did. Mick does exactly the same. He imitates us. But they're not in the same class music-wise or power-wise. Never were. I never said anything. I always admire them because I like their funky music and I like their style. I like rock and roll and the direction they took after they stopped trying to imitate us, But he's even going to do Apple now. He's going to do the same thing, Lennon concluded. He's obviously so upset about how big the Beatles are compared with him. He never got over it. Now he's in his old age and he is beginning to knock us, And he keeps knocking. I resent it because even his second effing record, we wrote it for him. Mick said peace made money. We didn't make any money from peace, In 1987, Mick Jagger said the Beatles breaking up was a good idea. Mick said it's ridiculous. No one should care if the Rolling Stones had broke up, should they? I mean, when the Beatles broke up, I couldn't give it a blink. I thought it was a very good idea. In 2015, Esquire Keith Richards said that if you're in the Beatles in the 60s, you just get carried away. You forget what it is you wanted to do. You started to do Sgt. Pepper. Some people think it's a genius album, but I think it's a mishmash of rubbish, kind of like Satanic Majesties. Oh, if you can make a load of blank, so can we. In 2016, Richards criticized the Beatles' live show, telling Radio Times, musically, the Beatles had a lovely sound and great songs, but the live thing, they were never quite there. So in 2020, Paul McCartney says the Beatles were better, and Mick Jagger responds with a zinger. So Paul said the Stones are rooted in the blues. He told that to Howard Stern. When they're writing stuff, it has to do with the blues. We had a little more influences. There's a lot of differences, and I love the Stones, but I'm with you. The Beatles were better. Mick Jagger caught wind of McCartney's comments during an appearance on Zane Lowe's Apple Music show, and he laughed at the idea. That's so funny, he said. He's a sweetheart. There's obviously no competition. The Rolling Stones is a big concert band in other decades and other areas. When the Beatles never did an arena tour, Madison Square Garden with a decent sound system, he continued. They broke up before that business started, the touring business for real. We started doing stadium gigs in the 70s and are still doing them now, Jagger concluded. That's the real big difference between these two bands. One band is unbelievably, luckily still playing in stadiums, and the other band, Paul got the last word in saying, in 2021, McCartney calls the Rolling Stones a blues cover band. Paul stated the Beatles work from a broader range of musical languages than the Stones. I'm not sure I should say it, but they're a blues cover band, and that's sort of what the Stones are. I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs. So I think the Beatles and the Rolling Stones got on well with each other, but as a band, they were never going to admit that one band was better than the other. They rightly defended their own band. John said it well when he said, I can knock the Beatles, but don't let Mick Jagger knock them. And I found this information interesting. We got to see how the bands viewed each other, good and bad. And it's funny that at times they spoke well of each other, but if you said something about the band, it was game on. And that's how it should be. You should be proud of your work. And these bands were rightly proud of what they had done through the years. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video. And if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help out the channel. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.